Spring. Noted. Good morning and welcome to the spring meeting of the North Carolina Secretaries Science Advisory Board. Start Franny Nilsson for work with the agency leadership and technical staff on the agenda, and to Paula for parking passes and other logistics, and to Peter for IT support. And if there's anybody joining online or wishing to join online that's had difficulty connecting, Peter Johnston is the person to contact about that, and he's going to be watching the chat for anything else that we need to be needs to be brought to our attention. Thank you to the board members attending today. I know that Detlef and Viney, or Doctors Kanapi and Anasia, are both absent due to teaching responsibilities today. And we have Gina, Dr. Kimball attending by phone. And any of you all in the room can remind me to check in with Gina on the phone if it's been a while since I've done so, in terms of making sure that she can hear us and be heard. As I noted in February, email to the board members, Dr. Betsy Tilson has stepped down as the state health director, and that also had her step away from serving on the board. I maintain that Betsy served at least 3 interests that were envisioned in the charter on the board. She was the state health director position kind of by title, but their charter also calls for a medical doctor. She checked that box, and also a scientist with expertise in environmental epidemiology, and she covered that box for us. So we'll miss her contributions to our work, including her steady participation and attendance at these meetings despite a busy schedule. And then also several times she served as the acting chairperson in my absence, which I appreciate. And we know that with time, DHHS will be in touch regarding a replacement for Betsy's position on the board. That's at one for them to fix with time. Let's see. I guess that moves us to reviewing and approving the agenda. It was sent by me Monday, and it was posted by the agencies on the board's website. Are there any questions or changes to the agenda? I'm going to walk over to the table and see if anybody has signed up to speak so far. And I'll also ask Peter if anybody online has asked to speak, because that may influence the agenda. And none signed up to speak so far. So we'll just hold any comments that come in between now and then requests until the public comment section at the end. Was just checking in case somebody had a particular interest in a topic so that we could cover it when that topic came up. The only thing that I'll mention about the agenda before I'll entertain a motion to approve it as offered is that we'll have some flexibility around when new Secretary Wilson will be addressing us. It's my understanding he won't be here until 11:30, but sometime between 11:30 and noon, we'll either stop what we're talking about or take a break to get to that period so that we can hear from the Secretary. So there may be some flexibility there with moving some things around before and after lunch. So with that, it'd be appropriate to entertain a motion to approve the agenda as drafted. So moved. Second. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? And Gina, is it okay with you?
Yes.
Great. Let us know through Peter in the chat if you have any difficulty hearing us at any time, and we'll get that addressed. And thanks for being present remotely today.
Welcome.
That moves us to the ethics statement, which I'll read for board members. It's the same one that you hear us read all the time. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it's the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So with that, I'll open the floor for anybody who has conflicts or the appearances of such to chat about them. Jamie?
I would just like to disclose that I receive funding from the state to study the toxicity of PFAS, and I also serve as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS.
And John?
Yes, I'd like to, John Vandenberg, I'd like to disclose that I've been an expert witness for the state in a case related to 1,4-dioxane.
Thank you. Elena?
I'd like to disclose that I was part of the team of scientists that worked on the report that went to the legislative body on 1,4-dioxane.
Thank you. John?
Well, given that point, I guess several of us are listed as contributing scientists. And my particular role in this report was just to provide some comments on a draft. That said, I also, on 1,4-dioxane, I was the division director responsible for the IRIS file on 1,4-dioxane back in 2010 and 2013.
Which is a foundation of the
foundation
hazard assessment section of the document.
Hazard and dose response. Yeah.
And dose response. Yeah, I'm also listed as a contributor there science-wise. My role in that was just providing peer review comments on a draft between draft and final. Anyone else? Elena?
Yeah. Just to add a little more detail, I was one of the scientists who actively helped with the analysis and the writing of the report.
Good. And I think a couple of us, provided peer review comments. So there's different levels of engagement there. There's folks that DEQ reached out to help prepare the document. There's folks whose science was leaned upon and referenced in the document. There's people that provided peer review when the board was given the opportunity to do that informally, which I think was April or May of last year. When that topic rolls around again, I would encourage people to participate to the extent that these disclosures, make clear what your boundaries are in terms of, can be a fact witness, in terms of telling you what information was provided and any other feedback that you feel is appropriate. I don't know that we'll get so far as, a motion to vote on the charge as received today, but we'll see. So it's probably participation today with a vote later, but it may be a vote depending on how fast we move through discussion of the material. So you can be thinking about that. All right, that moves us to approval of the meeting minutes from December. They were sent by me in mid-March and again on Monday with minor corrections regarding attendance of Gina. Thank you, Gina, and the spelling of the name of DHHS's new climate and health lead. And Virginia provided that correction. So thank you for the couple of corrections. They were circulated by me again with those corrections. Are there any additional questions or changes on the revised minutes that were provided on Monday? All right. Well, hearing none, it would be appropriate for a motion to adopt the minutes as offered in the revision provided on Monday.
Oh, I so move.
Thank you, Elena.
Second.
Thank you, John. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion to approve the minutes as revised and shared on Monday, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone
Aye.
opposed? Thank you, Gina. We heard that one. Anyone opposed? And anyone abstaining? Great. Well, that business is done, and I think that means that the first action item for the agencies is to post those, take the draft heading off and post those as final on the board's website. That brings us to item number 5, the agency updates that we're always appreciative of. I don't know what order folks prefer, but I'll call on Zach, I guess first, state epidemiologist and epidemiology section chief from DHHS. I'll call on you first, since you said you needed to duck out for a call.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the board, and I apologize for having to leave shortly, and I'll try to rejoin the meeting virtually after I can conclude that. So the first thing I just will mention briefly that's not specific to the work of this board, but in terms of agency impacts to be aware of from some of the recent federal activities, just at a high level. On March 25th, which feels like a long time ago now, we were informed of rescission of some federal funds that had been allocated to the state, mostly in the form of COVID supplemental funding for a variety of activities that were basically being designed to address gaps in our systems and programs that were identified through the pandemic. So the magnitude for North Carolina is still being determined as we're trying to get reimbursement forms and receipts and things for work that was done prior to the termination date of March 24th, but somewhere in the neighborhood of up to $230 million. And so that's impacted from a staffing perspective about more than 80 staff lost across the department in various areas, plus various contract employees. This spans a variety of activities. I'll say there's no direct impacts for our occupational and environmental epidemiology branch, which largely interfaces with this board, but we do have impacts across our immunization efforts, our immunization information systems, in particular, our communicable infectious disease monitoring systems. There are impacts from some of the SAMHSA rescissions in mental health and substance use services, and then our state laboratory of public health. There's also partner agencies that we've been working with that were part of our work with these funds, including local health departments, university partners, some hospitals, community-based organizations. So just for awareness on that. And then the other federal piece to be aware of is, as I'm sure you all are, yesterday we started receiving information about staff terminations across HHS, including at CDC, and particularly in the National Centers for Environmental Health and National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, both of which we collaborate with on for various programs here. So the impact of those staff, or in some cases, entire program or branch reductions, is not yet clear. So those are issues that we're working through. But at present, we're continuing to operate our environmental health data dashboard, which has had several new improvements to help better document and share information about environmental health impacts across the state. We're continuing to provide consultation and engagement with local health departments about how best to address environmental health concerns in their required community health assessments. And we're also now starting our preparation work for the upcoming heat season. We have expanded our heat health alert system to all 100 counties now, and that will all be ramping up soon. So those are sort of high level things. Other updates to share, we are continuing, of course, to support and work with the Department of Environmental Quality on the broader PFAS response. And recently, staff participated with DEQ and and others in a community public information session in Fayetteville that was focused around recent information on PFAS exposures through produce and foods. As we discussed during our last meeting in December with the board, we did submit our review and report to the North Carolina legislature in response to their questions about fluoride levels in drinking water. So our staff are continuing to review the emerging literature on fluoride in drinking water, and we may be following up with the board if there are additional questions that arise through that process. And then just a couple of non-environmental things to note. Also from our area, I will just note that we are thankfully coming out of a very severe seasonal flu season. We'll be updating our numbers today, so I don't know, but we're on track to exceed 500 reported flu deaths, which is the most that we've ever recorded since we started tracking both adult and pediatric flu deaths during the H1N1 pandemic in 2009. So glad to see that we're getting to the other end of that one. And then we are, of course, tracking and preparing for the possibility of measles introduction, given what's going on across the state, across the country and the world, really, with the continued expansion of the outbreak based in West Texas to multiple other states, along with the continued increase in importations of measles from other areas that where it continues to circulate, and we have unvaccinated travelers returning. So we're working very closely with our clinicians, with our local health departments, with a whole variety of other partners to make sure that everyone is prepared to respond if we were to end up with a case or a cluster here. Thankfully, we have not yet this year had a measles case reported, but that's a major area of work. And then the last thing I'll note is that Dr. Guidry, who is out of the state and wasn't able to join us, is continuing to support the Governor's Environmental Justice Advisory Council as co-chair. That group just had their first meeting last week, so that work continues. I think those were all the updates that I had, but I'm happy to take any questions you all might have.
Thank you, Zach. I'll open the floor to questions. Folks in the room first, and then we'll circle up with Gina in case she has any. Jamie?
Thanks for that update. This is a high-level question, and I don't know if you have the information to answer it at this time, but considering the federal level cuts that will impact your agency and its ability to provide support for the health of people living in North Carolina, is it possible to estimate how these cuts will impact the overall health of the state as the future rolls on?
Yeah, it's a challenge. Obviously, a lot of the work that we do is preventive, and that's under normal circumstances difficult to quantitate, but we are working with our department to make sure that we're articulating the specific impacts. That started last week with the funding rescissions and attempting to get clear on articulating those impacts and how that will affect the state. And we're sort of following that model with the, as we learn more about potential impacts of the staffing cuts and program cuts at the federal level. So we're trying to articulate as clearly as possible the impacts on our programs and on the people of North Carolina. But obviously it's very different from program to program.
And it may even be challenging to come up with those quantitative measures given reduction in force that you'll experience as a result of the cuts. So
Yeah.
we may severely underestimate the negative impacts of these types of cuts on population health in the state, perhaps.
It's certainly possible. Yeah. And that's, you raise a good point, and there are challenges just operationally and logistically managing some of these changes, and particularly the abrupt rescission of federal funds that does deflect attention from ability to kind of focus in on the broader impacts to the community. There's just a lot of work required to make sure that we're getting invoices and that type of detailed work done for a very rapid, basically, when we got the notice on the 25th, it was backdated to the 24th, so it doesn't leave a lot of time. So it does create some challenges in terms of ability to focus and articulate on the broader impacts.
Other questions? John?
Maybe along the same lines as, it sounds as though you've had a cut of basically 80 positions. Are you able to reassign people, or are those people actually have now been put on leave or have lost their jobs?
There is a very active effort to look for alternatives for people who had their positions eliminated because of the funding rescissions, including a lot of our temporary staff whose positions were extended through this week to give a little extra time to look for possibilities for moving folks into other positions. But given the amount of the funding loss, obviously that won't be possible for everybody.
So was the rescission just targeted to North Carolina, or was it to all state health agencies?
That was all state health agencies. The national total estimated impact was $11.4 billion. The state impact, as I said, it's going to be somewhere between 100 million and 230 million for North Carolina.
So with the announced cuts yesterday to the National Institutes of Health and all its associated agencies, those individuals would also be looking for jobs that they really should recognize that the state jobs are not there either, at least in many cases. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I think that's a concern. We don't know the impacts on our programs. The staffing cuts that happened at the federal level didn't involve any actual clear program cuts, but in some cases, all the staff on a given program, for example, the CDC's Building Resilience Against Climate Effects, or the CDC's Environmental Public Health Tracking, the NIOSH Occupational Safety and Health, those programs were, all staff were terminated. So we don't know the future. We know there will be impacts, but we don't know what the impacts will be. Our state health department, and I guess I could speak specifically for the epidemiology section, is about 90% federally funded, and our staff positions are about 95% federal. So that gives you some idea.
Thank you.
And I'll pause for a second and see if Gina has any questions for State Epidemiologist Zach.
No questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you,
Okay,
Zach.
thank you.
With that, I'll call on Sushma Masemore, Deputy Secretary for the Environment for the Department of Environmental Quality.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hey, just another recognition for all that you do with your busy schedules, providing your time, services, and talent to our state's priorities. All of our departments really appreciate what you do to help us. I wanted to give an overview of a couple of items. One that has not been covered, but we're happy to provide additional details in the future. But one is related to Hurricane Helene. 6 months ago, I believe yesterday, the storm hit Western North Carolina and even other parts of our state, and created a devastating impact to all the people that live and work there. It is now cited as the second largest or impactful disaster after Katrina, and the scale, the magnitude of the impact is going to be resonating forever within the area, but also throughout the state. We at the department have been deployed and mobilized from day one, even before the storm came. And there's a variety of things our department did and continues to do to support in the initial days, the rescue, the planning, the dam safety, landslide mapping, water systems related issues to emergency response. But I'm here to just give you an idea of what we're doing today in terms of response and recovery efforts. In one area is our drinking water systems and wastewater systems were very affected by the storms. The storm actually caused a significant amount of disruption because many of our systems are small systems. They're in waterways and flood zones. It's mountainous area. Just the centralized operations is not conducive to most of the region. But even larger systems like Asheville and other towns that were larger were affected. And so those immediate days after it, we had, significant disruption and delays in getting the drinking water systems up. Same thing with wastewater systems. So today, what we're seeing is most of the drinking water systems are up and running. There are some auxiliary systems that are on backups or additional permanent infrastructure upgrades are needed to create more resilient systems, and that's working. We're working through them. Richard's team, who's in back of me, his team is helping provide technical assistance and oversight along with many other state and local partners and federal partners. On the wastewater side, we still have about 33 systems or so that are in various stages of not normal operation. And most of those are from small scale to large scale, where they really were completely flooded away and will require a complete infrastructure rebuild. And so as these local governments are going through these very difficult times, they have to provide service. Some of them are resorting to temporary systems. But we at the department are providing emergency loans that the legislature authorized several months ago. These emergency loans are called bridge loans. It gives these local municipalities an opportunity to invest and get things started while they work through FEMA and other federal relief receiving. So they have to apply for grants and they have to get approvals, and all that money comes in after all that effort. So the state loan program is designed to bridge that gap. So our department has a division that has been actively involved in providing that service, hand-holding, providing as much information and assistance needed to utilize those bridge loans. And that is working. There's still money left, and we're continuing to provide that assistance. We also received, along with other states that were impacted by Helene, congressional appropriations on Hurricane Helene related recovery efforts. We received guidance from EPA just 2 weeks ago on how much North Carolina would be getting, and procedures and process for how that would be deployed. So our team is going through that guidance, working with EPA and deploying that to the local level with these communications and other mechanisms we've established with our partners to give them that assistance. So that money will be rolling out. I think the main thing is that it's going to be a process, and it's going to be a new process for folks out in Western North Carolina. And we have a whole of government, a whole of state approach towards bringing them back to as normal as possible because it's affecting so many folks. Two other areas that Hurricane Helene has created a very disruptive nature is related to all the debris that's created. We have a lot of forest material, a lot of synthetic material, tanks from underground storage operations and fuel tanks and refrigerators and things that got washed away. You can just imagine how much debris may have been created. In fact, the amount of acreage that we're talking about is unheard of from previous storms in North Carolina. So the department is leading the effort along with FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the emergency management, the state group, along with the counties and local entities to manage the collection and the deployment and staging of the debris. We have our recycling partners, we have our landfill partners, and we have a variety of folks working together to first identify where does this debris get moved to. Over 100 sites have been authorized now by the Division of Waste Management to create these staging areas. And then in some cases, the debris may need to be incinerated. So our Division of Air Quality has provided EPA as well as local guidance, state guidance on best practices and permitting related matters for air curtain incinerators and other forms of disposal techniques. But there's going to be significant amount of debris that is not going to be in roadways or waterways, that is going to be untouched. That is on private lands, in national forests and state lands that are not in anyone's way, but it's still down debris. And that is a concern for wildfires, but also any remaining debris that is not removed is a concern for wildfires. And you've seen the number of wildfires that were that were announced just last week. They continue today. We did have some rain events that helped reduce that. But just to give you an idea, there's a whole task force on local, state, and federal agencies that are just trying to quantify and better understand the scale of the potential impact when drought and low precipitation events occur in the state. We are at the Air Quality Division are providing air quality monitoring support, because as you have burning, you will see PM 2.5 and other atmospheric impacts that will affect the health of the community and the neighbors. So I just wanted to stop there on Helene. There's a lot going on. We're happy to give you a deeper dive in future meetings if there's any interest on any of that. And I'm happy to coordinate with Zach and other state agencies to give you any updates. Secondly, I just wanted to let you know that as Zach has mentioned, there are a lot of EPA and other federal agency reviews and actions occurring currently. EPA has announced that the agency would be reconsidering and reviewing major federal regulatory actions across our air program, across our clean water program, across the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, also the Clean Water Act, so that affects our wastewater discharge program, the hazardous waste program, and many other programs. We don't know which programs EPA plans to take up first, but we know on the air side, it would be a significant number of regulatory actions that would be revisited. Based on that, we will get a better feel for how we proceed with any state-related regulatory requirements under our delegation program. I'm happy to get into deeper dives as we learn more on the federal front. Thirdly, on the emerging contaminants, 1,4-dioxane is something we're going to talk about today. But what's happening in the field is that we have been giving the Environmental Management Commission some updates related to 1,4-dioxane measurements across the state. You may have heard that there were exceedances or high levels of 1,4-dioxane measured from the discharges of Asheboro wastewater system, and the downstream drinking water systems were alerted, and they were monitoring for potential impacts. This occurred in mid-January, I believe also in February. The highest levels we have seen thus far for 1,4-dioxane were detected from that discharge. We're working through some of the ways to handle that, including working with the EMC on a potential path forward. And that includes a regulatory process where the EMC has requested a way to require source reduction through minimization activities. That regulatory proposal will be brought to the EMC in the May meeting when we convene for additional discussion by the Water Quality Committee. Secondly, for 1,4-dioxane, there's also a ongoing state litigation related to DEQ's authority to regulate that chemical under the Clean Water Act through the standards development process. We don't know the dates for that, but that is also ongoing while we pursue additional mechanisms with the Environmental Management Commission. And then finally, related to PFAS, this is something that EPA has, under the new administration, has identified that as a priority. Specifically, how that priority translates into the current priority and activities, we're still waiting to hear on that. But you may recall that EPA did promulgate the drinking water standards for PFAS last year. And the states are required under our primacy rules to adopt those standards. North Carolina started that process. We went through public comment process and are in currently at staging bringing those rules and public comments to the North Carolina Commission of Public Health. They're the entity that eventually adopts the MCLs for drinking water. So that's on schedule. We are going to bring that forward to that commission, and we'll give you an update as that moves forward. Secondly, we talked a little bit in the past about groundwater standards. This is in the purview of DEQ. Groundwater standards are used for mainly two reasons. One is when there's a contamination from a source or is affecting groundwater wells, whether it's used for drinking water purposes or other uses. The groundwater standards provide a mechanism for what the cleanup levels need to be. It also helps homeowners who have private wells to know what is a safe level for use, especially if they plan to sell their property and they have PFAS in their water. It informs them what is considered health safe level for any treatments or no treatments that they may be, or filtration they may be using for their wells. These groundwater standards were we have what we call the interim maximum levels that are in place for about a year for all PFAS for which we have health data. That's in effect right now. The EMC has requested us to do rules for 3 of those PFAS. We did public hearings across the state, and that rulemaking process is culminating into a hearing officer's report that will be presented to the EMC most likely, not in May, but in July. And that hearing officer's report would then be discussed by the groundwater committee to then move forward to the EMC for adoption for those 3 PFAS chemicals for which groundwater standards will be established. And then finally, we talked a little bit in the past about surface water standards. This is the other part of our regulatory program that allows how much PFAS is in a discharge from a regulated entity. Those regulated entities are controlled by DEQ. Those industries and publicly operated treatment facilities like municipal wastewater plants, those are under our purview under the Clean Water Act. So what are the levels that would be allowed under the surface water regulations? The POTWs that I just mentioned also receive waste from industries. They're usually called significant industrial users. They would also contribute to the loading, the influent loading of those POTWs. So holistically, the surface water regulations affect industrial sources, but also uncontrolled sources that you and I discharge into our community or public water systems. Where we are on that rulemaking is we've been instructed by the Environmental Management Commission to look at source reduction methods of reducing discharges. Primarily looking at those SIUs or significant industrial users that discharge into the municipal intakes, and then those direct dischargers that discharge into the surface waters of the state under our purview. So we are bringing back a method of what EMC has requested to minimize the amount of pollution discharge from these industrial entities. Those rules are planned to be presented to the Water Quality Committee at the EMC in May, and then they'll discuss, and then the next step would be to go up to the full commission. So stay tuned on that as we pursue, PFAS-related regulatory activities. And then if I may indulge you in one more update, we often talk about our lessons learned and ongoing response to the Comores-related contamination and the cleanup levels, as well as the contamination that has affected drinking water supplies for those surrounding communities. I wanted to pull up, Jared has produced these maps I wanted to pull up a map of the southeast part of the North Carolina 10-county region. Jared, would you be able to pull up that?
He's working on it.
So what you see here is at the center of the upper left corner is the Chemours Fayetteville Works plant. That is the location where the discharges from releases, emissions releases, as well as discharges from wastewater were started that eventually ended up in the river and in the air, deposited through wet and dry deposition across the state. And what we're seeing is as the wind carried that pollution, the near site, which is all the areas that you see in red dots closest to the facility and the green dots, those are all the wells that have been tested near the facility. That has gone, we've done this for over the last 7 years or so. And this process has been slow. And many homeowners are finding out over time whether they're eligible for testing under the consent order. Through analysis by our staff, Jared led this work along with our Division of Waste Management to look at mathematically where is the possible extent of contamination from those contributing sources near the facility. And the light blue sectors that you see demonstrates potential modeled extent of the near site impacts. So what we've done recently, and Zach mentioned it, that we had a community meeting, a virtual meeting yesterday. We reached out to all the public health officials. All of those areas in that light blue shading are now notified that they're eligible for testing. Chemours is basically saying, go ahead, we're all allowing everybody in those home sites to be now eligible for the consent order related testing and filtration options if they exceed the levels. So that includes 150,000 letters that have been sent out to homeowners. Potentially about 10,000 could be eligible under the consent order because not all of them are on private wells. So we'll determine that over time. Additionally, the map shows the purple area along the Cape Fear River. This is the floodplain related impacts that the pollution carried when it was flooding. We've had Florence, Matthew, all those hurricanes. And there's a reason to believe that that pollution was also affecting home sites around the floodplain. So there are about 700 plus homes that are now included as part of the consent order. And then finally, I want to draw you towards the coast. You'll see Pender County, Columbus County, Brunswick County, and New Hanover County. Those are what we call the lower Cape Fear impacted counties. And for about 2.5, now 3 years, we've been telling Chemours to assess the impact of their activities and the wells as well as the municipal supply to that area from floodplain, from leaking pipes and sewer pipes and drinking water pipes, from biosolids applications, from ASR wells. Holistically, all of that work assessment has been completed, and we're reviewing that now. And then we will be coming out in the next few months or so, another delineation of potentially additional areas in those 4 counties and those homeowners that would be eligible for testing because those results are currently under review. But I just wanted to give you sort of a visual of what we're looking at. It's a significant part of our state and a large portion in terms of area, but also homeowners. One thing I forgot to tell you is that on the light blue area, the northeast part of the state, we did through this process now have included Hoke County and Harnett County into the consent order related response. So I'll pause here. I covered a lot, and thank you for your time, but I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, well, thank you. We appreciate it. I was making some notes because it came across to me that all of us that grew up in a life of science had a microscope at one time, and you learned about the coarse knob and the fine knob, but you don't use the fine knob until you've got the coarse knob to get things in focus. And I appreciated the updates from you and Zach about how the state is prioritizing the coarse knob work of serving the most citizens in terms of being engaged in things like hurricane relief. I noted that over the course of my career, I've been involved in some debates about whether the concentration of selenium that's in fish that's protective of wildlife, is X versus Y, and they're very close together. That's kind of a fine knob thing, but handling breakdown of systems and previously experienced amounts of solid waste is coarse knob issues that serves a lot of citizens. So good for you all for being focused on the most pressing needs while you're carrying on all this other work. I'll open it up for any questions or observations.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Jamie, please.
So I have a question that's related a little bit to the consent order and a little bit to the federal drinking water standards. So first, the federal drinking water standards, how quickly after those are promulgated on the federal level, are they implemented at the state level? Is it immediate?
There's a schedule in the EPA's final rule. They have to be in compliance by 2029.
So the drinking water facilities have to be in compliance by 2029. Okay, so then,
And I'm guessing that, Richard? Okay, yeah.
okay, so they're not really considered then a state level until 2029?
So what I understand, we can actually, would love to give a presentation on is that we did this to the EMC. There are some incremental steps they have to show progress towards. There's a monitoring requirement, there's a reporting requirement. And depending on the size and the scale of the facility, they're staged through. So the idea is that if they need to treat their drinking water to meet the MCLs, then all of that has to be done by the compliance date, which is sometime, I don't know the month, but the year is 2029.
Okay, and so I'm guessing though that because these are for public drinking water systems, then this will not impact any of the levels of consideration under the consent order. They'll still remain at 10 parts per trillion.
The MCLs does include Gen X. So it does impact the consent order in that, but it's the same number, 10 parts per trillion, so they're equivalent. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Okay.
John?
You covered a great deal of information. and Thank you for that. Maybe taking them in the order about the Hurricane Helene problems. When Katrina occurred, there was a use of an air curtain then as well for some of the residential debris especially. Whereas in the Western United States, it's residential and a lot of vegetation, I think. I think from the experience, the group that I was with was involved in the review of the air curtain risks from that, from dioxins especially. And the risks were not particularly high, but there was also an effort to try to separate out the plasticky kind of household materials from the vegetation materials. Is that occurring as well in the use of the air curtains for the Helene debris?
Yes, we're trying to prioritize that for the hurricane. Most of it is vegetative matter that we're seeing. And in fact, I don't know exactly how many, there are like 20 or so air curtain incinerator sites and operations that have been authorized. And I can show you next time if you're interested to know how it really works. They're basically a huge container that's used. But to answer your question, that's why we got our recycling team involved in this, so to maximize our removal of synthetic material from burning.
Right. I think that's really important, is to try to do that separation to the extent possible. I realize it's a terrible mess. I've been there a couple of times and it's incredible. The amount of work that's been done is also very impressive. Turning to the second question, you talked about the 1,4-dioxane levels being quite high, recently measured. Are those facilities that are discharging into the streams and then ultimately into the Cape Fear River, are they not subject to any controls at this point?
So, like I said, for Asheboro, their discharge is influenced by probably two facilities.
Right.
One is a landfill related leachate matter, and the other is an industrial facility. It's from what we can gather is that that industrial facility has a ability to reduce 1,4-dioxane, and they have been for the last several years. But they were going through operational difficulties, and they were doing some cleanups, and from what our staff is gathering, there were some activities or changes that were occurring. To answer your question, whether or not they're obligated or required to minimize that is not in place. Of course, if there could have been a way to hold or stage it in some kind of holding tanks and manage that waste, there could have been other ways to practice that operational need. But it did end up in Asheboro's intake and eventually literally just discharged into the surface waters of the state.
So will this report that's under review and the next part of the discussion here inform the setting of water quality standards by the state? Is that the point of it?
I think what we have been instructed by the Environmental Management Commission to pursue more of a source minimization approach. And the standards approach may be something that the EMC may take up in the future. But right now, it is like for that facility, if they had a BMP, a best management plan, a practices plan, or a source reduction approved strategy, then that effect could have been reduced or minimized or informed for additional entities to then weigh in and require actions to be taken. So I think that's what we're working on right now, is to deliver the EMC's requested minimization regulatory approach for 1,4-dioxane.
Last point is about the map up here. Recently, I was able to use some special glasses that let people that have color problems like I have. I can't see red green very well. I can't distinguish these colors.
That's a good point.
The two top ones anyways, the numbers 1 and number 2 look exactly the same to me. So anyways, it might be useful to think about color combinations that are a little bit more visible to people like me. So thank
Message
you.
received,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about.
Okay.
Yeah, our website is supposed, I don't know if this is on our website yet or not, but our website does account for that kind of user needs. And thank you for pointing that out.
I can't see a difference at all between 1 and 2 there.
Well, they're different.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
If Dr. Anasia was here, he would be geeking out about how much that looks like a windrose probably.
It sure
And
does.
so you'll have to share it with him separately. I'll entertain one more question, then I kind of need to scooch us along for the rest of the agenda.
A couple of quick questions. When that map is posted to the website, can you send us, can somebody see that the board gets sent a link?
Absolutely.
And the other question I had was, what were the levels of 1,4-dioxane that were measured?
So I'm going to go by memory. I recall one number at 3,200 parts per billion. Is that right, Richard? About 3,200 to 2,800. Yeah. Some of them were grab samples and others were split samples. DEQ collected samples. The city of Asheboro, they collected samples, and both of those were in 4 digits that I just mentioned.
Thank you.
And I will ask Jean if she has any questions since she's on the phone and didn't get a chance to raise her hand otherwise.
No questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. While Franny gets set up to introduce the next topic, I'm going to suggest, and you guys can tell me if this is a good idea, a 5-minute break, no more than 5, so that we can get this next topic started, and then we're going to work all the way through until Secretary Wilson gets here, because we have Rich that needs to leave at noon. And so quick break, get coffee or water or whatever, and then we're going to jam on this topic until the secretary gets here, because we need to visit with him. Does that work for people?
Fine.
Sounds good.
All right,
Yes.
5.
That is an aspect of the 2024 report that is used to determine the health-based concentration for a lifetime exposure to 1,4-dioxane. And then again, this is where our report lives on our website. For anyone that wants to view it, there is the link.
Thank you, Franny. I appreciate it. So for board members, you've heard the charge from me via email and reiterated again here today by Dr. Nilsson. The document's final. It was drafted to be responsive to a specific scope, audience, and timeline. But we're being asked now about its scientific foundations as having continued utility in science-guided management. Is it scientifically reasonable? So that's for a science document and a final document. That's kind of a pass-fail. It's also kind of a process of reviewing methods, I think, more than the actual data that goes into it. That's just the way that I see it. But I encourage us to be responsive to the charge, maybe not overly constrained by it though, because I know there are other ideas out there. So share what you like, but I may remind you of the limited nature of the scope of the charge with regard to scientific reasonableness of something that's done. When I say don't feel overly constrained by it, if I feel like, something's out of bounds, maybe we can put that into a parking lot for future reference, or it's spring, put it in a garden and let it grow somewhere, if you don't like the parking lot analogy. So I don't want it to feel like, I have to watch what I say about 1,4-dioxane. We want to get the best information out there. But if it strays too far away from a commentary on the report, it'll probably go over here into the garden. So you can share whatever you like, but I'm going to suggest also that we could walk through the elements that comprise scientific reasonableness when you're reviewing a document like this. And I would offer that we could just simply walk through, after some general comments, a discussion of the methods, and then a discussion of the data sources and their interpretation, and then a discussion of whether the conclusions draw from the data. And if we did it like that, we would both kind of systematically walk through those major elements of what scientifically reasonable reporting is. And we will either have documented that it passes those, or that there's some concerns, and then the basis for our concerns. And it also might be a way just to provide some structure so that the state hears back those different elements instead of jumping around. So we don't have to do it that way, but after some general comments, I might suggest that we could take it systematically as what methods were used, were they clear and appropriate and followed? What data sources were used, were they the right ones and adequate? And then what the conclusions were, and were they supported by the data? So if you like that approach, that's what we'll do, but I'm going to open it up for general comments first in the interest of not constraining it too much. Elena.
First of all, I like your approach. And now I'm going to put Franny on the spot. I'm sorry, Franny. The overview presentations that you have given previously, that might provide a useful framework in terms of systematically going through it if such is available.
I can pull one up. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the
John, general comments?
General comment. I think it says provide formal feedback regarding approach and finding, which kind of follows along with what you were saying. How do you anticipate the formal feedback being provided?
I think it could be a combination of things. An open discussion here, I think, is helpful. A candid discussion when we have agency leadership present to hear it. If there's general consensus, somebody could offer a summary statement that we could form into a motion and vote on it. Sometimes that's a restatement of the charge as an affirmative or a negative, depending on what the consensus is. It could also be that we handle it like we've handled a lot of issues where we benefit from the discussion. And then if Franny is taking notes and I'm taking notes, we could prepare a synthesis statement and circulate that for review. It's like, here's what we heard. Do you agree with that or not? And then sometime either at or before the next meeting, provide that summary. So I guess long way of saying I don't have a preconceived notion about it. I think it'll depend on the nature of the feedback today.
If I might, so I think we need to be very clear what the board's feelings are, but I guess the question would be to perhaps to Franny, or is the timing of going through, finishing it today versus some follow-up in another, what could take a month or something like that, if that matters. I don't know if it does or not. Does the,
I don't get the sense that it has to be finished today, but it's,
I would say, take your time. There's no urgency to this. To add to the value of this, we often get this question. The department produced a report that is meaningful and important. Has the scientific community weighed in, or have we received any kind of feedback? So the board is the closest we have in the departments to be able to seek your input on this. So that's why I felt like it was a good way for us to, because we were in a rush to meet a deadline. And thank you all for a few of you that were able to provide that initial, guidance and reviews and input and writing. But now the whole body has a chance to weigh in. So it's not a rush, but it is a good way for us to say, yes, our science advisory board has weighed in. They've identified this, and to be able to convey that.
So would you find the transmittal of the board's views on this to be concise or more extensive in terms of the systematic discussion we just had about going through each of the parts of it in terms of the approach and the findings? What is the most valuable to you?
I would say would be most valuable, and of course Franny can weigh in on this, but at least perhaps a memo or a letter that gives an overall message. But it's really the devil's in the detail, right? So any questions or concerns regarding the evaluation is in the methodology, some of the things that Franny has highlighted.
Yeah.
So we might get questions on that. So perhaps in addition to an overall message, perhaps breaking it down to these components where you want to highlight the strengths and the weaknesses or cautionary statements, if any, regarding the data, the analysis, the interpretation, and the use.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
and Gina, any foundational questions before we jump in then? Or overall observations?
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thanks. So go ahead, Jamie.
You alluded to this, Tom, in your introduction to this topic, but I'm wondering if we're going to have a discussion explicitly about the phrase scientifically reasonable, or will that evolve through the discussion?
I think it'll evolve through the discussion. I think it might be more helpful to get into the technical weeds on these different sections and see if there's any disagreement. I don't want to stymie it, but I also don't want to burn a whole bunch of time on what reasonable is going to mean as a consensus with the limited time that we have. Is that okay? Remember, we walked away from scientifically sound or scientifically defensible and settled at the last meeting on reasonableness as a way to get away from, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. You could have done it a different way. There's lots of different ways to look at data was a point that we made. And as long as this approach is reasonable. So maybe what we can do as we go through it is if you like my general headings of what I think, would be constitute reasonable, then we're in good shape. If you think we need to add some, then we'll add them. But I guess I would offer that an adequate review of scientific quality or reasonableness might include feedback on the methodology. So that's one. And then scrutinizing data and assumptions, and then assessing the conclusions and the recommendations. You could also seek clear, transparent, reproducible, free of bias. I mean, there's other things that can come in along the way. So how about methods? And Franny, you might have to help me take some notes now. But methodology, are there any questions about methodology? Are the methods used appropriate for human health risk assessment? Are they described clearly and in sufficient detail to allow somebody to replicate it? We know that kind of at our urging, they use the US EPA Human Health Risk Assessment to inform decision-making framework. And it's my observation that that's a framework that's still being used. You can find a January update on EPA's website of that. It's also my observation that the state used all 4 of the steps in that process. And of hazard identification, dose response, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. So one observation, at least from one board member, is that, yeah, the methodology was an appropriate current methodology and all steps were followed. But I'll invite other perspectives on methods. Jamie.
So I think it's important that we reemphasize in the executive summary that this is just for drinking water exposures. So the exposure assessment was limited to data available in water sources used for drinking water. But I think we may also want to point out that the exposure characterization or assessment focused on sort of the general population level exposures with some high exposures and didn't necessarily dive into sensitive subpopulations or those who might have characteristics that make them more susceptible to either exposure or effects from exposure. So I think the methods are appropriate, but we just need to be very clear that the methods were intended for general population exposures in drinking water.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, I tried to say at the outset that the report was done for a particular audience on a particular timeline with a particular scope, and drinking water was in the state legislation. And it influenced the data that was used in the exposure assessment and gathering all the data. And we can talk about that next when we get into data sources. The state excluded some things that were synthesis documents that included air routes of exposure, for example. So good point on making sure that the intro reiterates what it is and isn't. If you point out that it was done for general populations and didn't provide, you know, any special consideration for particularly exposed populations, do you consider that to be a discounting of its scientific reasonableness? Again, it's kind of a pass-fail question, I think, at this point, and we can provide some granularity, but if we can get into the habit of saying, you know, this is granular detail versus a fatal flaw, I think that'll be helpful in making progress.
I think that the approach was appropriate for what it was intended to do, and that was to create a health protective value for people living in North Carolina. I think it is important, though, that we do be very specific about the intent and indicate that there may be other pathways and routes of exposure that are important for the population, but this particular document focused on drinking water to the general population.
Gotcha. Any other comments on the overall approach of using EPA's Human Health Risk Assessment decision-making framework as a foundation? John?
Tom, I just want to be clear about my role as an expert witness for the state, and that is that it was really rather narrow regarding the effects analysis of hazard identification and dose response analysis. So I did not have any role in terms of the exposure assessment. There was no debate about methodology being employed, and I will probably refrain from talking much about risk characterization as well. So as it turns towards the methodology and the exposure assessment, I would say that the methodology employed is consistent with what's used pretty much worldwide in terms of the approach that's described here in the Human Health Risk Assessment Program. So I think it was sufficiently characterized with the comments that Jamie made that, you know, it was a specific purpose, specific focus, and that there didn't necessarily include all aspects that might be considered in a full risk assessment, as is the case in this here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Other comments on overall approach or the methodology that was used as one aspect of scientific reasonableness, reproducibility? Jamie?
Do we also want to make sure to specify that this was not necessarily a systematic review? It didn't follow systematic review criteria because that's not really something that is explicitly required under risk assessment guidelines. but that the data sources upon which the hazard and dose response data were evaluated did use systematic review approaches, so that US EPA IRIS is a systematic review approach. So maybe be clear that the sources to which the document cites use a very clearly defined systematic review approach. Therefore, this document didn't have to follow those explicit approaches because they cite to those other approaches. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And again, it followed the board's direction, which was with, again, back in the intro part about it being for a particular audience on a particular timeline. There wasn't going to be the time to do an independent systematic review of the compound. And so to build on others, we encourage them to adopt other systematic reviews and augment that by checking the date of each of those systematic reviews for when their literature cutoff was and pulling anything that would be new. I think that'll be real important for the next section on data and assumptions after overall methodology, but which bin we put that in for comments, it's still a really good comment in terms of appropriateness of the data source. And I hear you saying that the data source, it wasn't a synoptic review, but it incorporated and built upon those that were for the hazard assessment section.
That's right. And that is a scientifically reasonable approach to evaluating risks from exposures to hazardous agents.
Gotcha. Thanks. Other comments on overall approach?
Yeah.
Elena, please.
The other, agree with all the foregoing discussion, and we used as the basis, or what wound up being used as the basis, was the actual IRIS assessment, and that goes through an extensive peer review process. To speak to Jamie's point about the systematic review is that, yes, we also did look at other documents or other studies that had come out since the IRIS report or since the IRIS assessment was published. But even with that, with looking at those and some other approaches like Health Canada, for the qualitative reasons stated in the report, it was concluded that the original IRIS assessment was the most health protective because the other proposed modes of action that had been investigated apply only to the liver, and 1,4-dioxane causes cancer at multiple sites in both rats and mice, and in both genders of rats and mice. So liver was, ultimately considered the most sensitive in the original IRIS document, and that has been for the sub-studies that were subsequently done, they focused on the mode of action for liver. So it had to be limited to that because no other data was brought forward or was available for modes of action for other cancer endpoints. But it is multi-site, multi-species, and both sexes of both species. And I mean, refer to rats and mice specifically.
Good. I think I'll move us along from comment on the methods, realizing that you'll get a chance to revisit this in a write-up, and move on to data and assumptions, because I think we're getting into data and assumptions now in terms of the discussion, the sources of data for the hazard assessment we've talked about a bit. Let's back up a little bit and follow the sequence of events in the report itself and talk about the sources of exposure data. John offered that his input was largely on the effects section. Mine was largely on the exposure data section. And let's ask some questions about that. What were the sources of the data? Were they reliable, adequate, and clearly described? That's another thing that influences the scientific reasonableness of a report. And on this exposure side in particular, what's the board's thoughts on data and assumptions around exposure data, sources, reliability, and adequacy?
If I might comment about that. I think that the grounding in some ways to what the actual environmental occurrences are in North Carolina to the national data sets is very useful. It highlights that the levels in North Carolina are on the higher end, if you will, of the across the country. Unfortunately, these are data that were limited to 2013 to 2015. So I think it's worth making a point that the newest data that we've just heard about actually includes data that may be even higher than that in some instances. I think that's what we're hearing is very recent data suggests that levels have not necessarily declined, at least in terms of high levels. So again, we're not commenting on this report, but I think in our report back to as a board view would point out that there are some evidence of even higher levels being observed recently.
A general finding might offer a little bit of additional context on that is in addition to the UMCR data, they did use DEQ's ambient data sets and facility-specific data, including discharger data and raw water intake data. So the first line of the table on exposure data does go through, I think, 2022 or 23.
23, it says. Yeah.
So there's some newer data in there.
Right.
There'll be newer data yet, but I take your point. Maybe a more general statement is one that I'll offer on my own perspective is that the data included exposure assessments. It included exposure data from across North Carolina, DEQ's ambient surface water program, wastewater monitoring, public water supplies, and then drinking water data from raw water and finished water from facilities. So it seems like the net was drugged pretty wide in terms of a general scientific reasonable statement of sources of data. It didn't just pick one source of data. There's multiple sources of data. It included a QA/QC step and referenced the source of the QA/QC step. So it was, there was a data, not just gathering, but a data quality step. And the synthesis of it, I thought was useful. The graphic depictions that we just saw give, again, back to intended audience, intended use. The graphic depictions provide the location and magnitude of the exposures of concern. So that's a general observation on adequacy of data related to exposure. Another one is that the level of detection frequency in the stats, the level of detection was below the hazard level that was used. So there's actually a lot of information available in the no detects. If the detection limit was above your health-based screening level, then there might not be much information in the no detects, but there's a lot of information in these no detects here because the 0.07 level of detection is an order of magnitude lower than the 0.35 screening value that was used. There's a lot of data there. I think you could quibble about the use of normal versus non-parametric statistics and summarizing that data. But again, in terms of what's reasonable, it's not unreasonable to have truncated all the non-detects and told people the frequency of detections and then provided summary statistics for the detections. It may not be how everybody would do it, but it's not unreasonable.
Right. I agree with everything you just said, actually. As well put is that there are a number of different ways of characterizing these type of data, and this is quite reasonable. It's not the only way, but it's reasonable.
And I think that level of detection issue is kind of a big one that when we get to the conclusions, I might revisit. So I think there's a lot of information in that column about the frequency of detections where there's big chunks of no detects. And I'm not sure that was a conclusion that's highlighted in the risk characterization section at the very end so much as the focus on the column of the summary statistics for those samples that were above detection. It's all there, though. There's nothing hidden or untransparent about it. It's just that there's a lot of information in the NCDEQ text in this case because the detection limit actually is sensitive relative to the effects level. Other comments on sources of data on exposure, and then we could revisit the sources of data relative to effects. Anything else on exposure? I think the only other thing I had on exposure assessment is there could be referenced or aside or just something for future references where if somebody could go and find the data set themselves, because then it could be, the independently verified part of it. Right now, it's reproducible in terms of methodology. It wouldn't be reproducible in terms of checking somebody's math without access to the data set. And maybe that's an easy thing to do in the future as the data set expands. Both Jamie and Elena had good comments already that are captured on the recording for future reference on adequacy of the data, sources of data, their adequacy, their clarity for the effects assessment. But I'll encourage us to provide any additional context on that, moving on from exposure to effects data quality.
Tom, if I might go before you go to this, the way this is structured in
Sorry.
Franny's presentation is actually quite nice. That would be an appropriate way to bring some of the conclusions forward, because it's kind of easy to grasp the data sources and the nature of the data here for the effects. But you also had on the exposure in a moment ago, everything was checked. And I think it can be a very effective graphical thing that we might consider including in the response back from the board. So, good job.
Thanks.
So I think that, that can be a comment about two other aspects of reasonableness, which is clear and transparent.
Right.
And, but also a concurrence with the sources of the
metrics
data.
Here, yeah.
Others on sources of data for effects. It's a good point to remember Jamie's point about, it's not a synoptic review, but it incorporated those that were useful by reference and then built on them with more current literature.
And to kind of reiterate what Elena mentioned, is that these reviews upon which the document relies or cites to are conducted in a publicly transparent way and offer opportunity for peer review. And we could emphasize the value of peer review in the value of these documents cited to in the report.
Anything else on data sources or assumptions relative to the effects assessment? We're sometimes encouraged to pursue things as a range of risk. I think EPA's source document in this case had 3 different screening values in addition to the 0.35 micrograms per liter, which is 1 in a million hazard risk. They also offered order of magnitude above and above of the risk factors that would be equivalent to 1 in 100,000 lifetime cancer risk or 1 in 10,000. I'm not suggesting that the use of 1 × 10⁻⁶ for cancer risk is inappropriate or the state's unreasonable, It's just that there was a range offered in EPA's work that was cited as the basis here. It's clear that the state was grounding it also in the drinking water regulation. The surface water protection regulation that would have been used to form a standard.
Again, I'm not going to comment specifically about the mode of action or hazard identification part of it, but what's not shown here is the consideration of additional studies that were published following those. Well, the TSCA is pretty recent, but it might be worth a comment that the literature was evaluated for more recent publications and considered in the assessment. I think that's a strength of it.
Yeah, and both sides of if you want to move, into the effects assessment mode of action part of the discussion, the report clearly has an entire page on different scientific opinion, including articles published in the same year that were synoptic reviews talking about mode of action and whether that supported a threshold model or a linear extrapolation model for low doses, and then the basis for what was chosen. So both sides of that presented, and then a rationale for what was used. So again, in terms of completeness, transparency, both perspectives on that were offered, and a decision made clear in terms of which one was going to be used for the foundation to the report.
Yeah. One other thing to note is that the assumptions that were used are pretty clearly delineated as well. So that's another aspect of the assumptions in the numerical analysis that were from the EPA document and others. The assumptions and uncertainties were pretty well laid out. And again, that's part of the aspect of transparency.
Thank you. Other perspectives on any aspect of the effects data, realizing that we're going to move into risk characterization after this, since we've evaluated overall methodology. We've covered sources of data for exposure, sources of data for effects, and then the risk characterization, I guess, would be next before we get to conclusions. I don't know, but we could check in the write-up that since this was published, EPA did come out with the final TSCA report in November 2024. And I think, but it's worth checking whether or not it leaned on the same cancer slope factor that was used in here, which, if it did, would be another line of evidence on reasonableness of an approach that used the same thing several months earlier. But I can provide that link, and maybe Jamie knows.
Oh, no, I was going to just make a comment about the margin of exposure approach, but I can wait if.
No, go ahead.
So I just want to, again, emphasize that we explain in our approach of scientific reasonableness that the margin of exposure is a reasonable way to characterize anticipated risk for carcinogenic substances. There is some debate about whether or not it's appropriate for non-cancer substance or health effects. So I think we should emphasize that this is a reasonable approach for non-threshold substances. It might not work for all compounds, but here it is a reasonable approach.
Yeah, and that'll tie back to that the threshold response, threshold approach versus linear approach was discussed in the document. A path was taken, and then once that path was taken, this would be the appropriate risk characterization step from that data. I gotcha. Other perspectives on either effects data or the risk assessment from putting things together, exposure and effects.
Tom, I have a question about something you just said, was that there was a report finished in 2024 The Tosca report was done in finished in 2020. So what report are you referring to?
There's a 2024 Tosca revision that incorporated drinking water in particular, and this document notes that the Tosca synthesis from earlier was not used because it included air routes, and I don't think had maybe a drinking water route.
It
But
did,
the Tosca revision in 2024 incorporated fence line communities by air and drinking water as a source, and all of that ties back to a cancer slope factor approach.
and so I haven't reviewed the Tosca document in a few months. But I believe that the cancer slope factor that was provided in that report was inclusive of all the exposures. And so it was actually smaller than the IRIS value.
When was that report finished? Do you know, last year?
They did a risk characterization supplement. And I thought that was finished in 2023, but they may have produced another like addendum to it in 2024.
November of 2024.
Okay.
No, sorry, November of 24? Okay, thank you.
That's November 24, supplement to the risk evaluation for 1,4-dioxane from the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. But importantly, it has a whole bunch of reviewers from Office of Water, Office of Research and Development, lots of, it seems like, more of a whole of EPA approach. It's 570 pages as a supplement. So it's another synoptic review, but this time it does have a section particular drinking water. I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I would point out, that one aspect of reasonableness would be, I think you made this point earlier, if you have subsequent data with which to evaluate the conclusions that were drawn earlier, it'd be a way to say, you're not just commenting on what was done based on what was available at the time, but does it hold up?
Right.
Are other people using that same method or those same data or those same approaches after the fact?
So since this report was finished in May 1st of 2024, that was obviously not available if it came out in November. But again, it might be worth a comment, as you just said, to bring it right up to date as the most current. So.
I believe the public comment draft was available before it was finalized. But I can't remember what the draft was, like which version of the draft was that I had. But yeah, I don't have the final version cited in this report.
And this would be the time to ask for any comments in particular on the cancer slope factor that was chosen for the state's document last year, just because that was called out in their charge to us. So it will be something, since it's called out specifically, that we're going to need to address specifically in terms of whether or not it's reasonable.
As well, recuse myself.
Any comment on that at this point? Seeing none, then I'll maybe move us to a last section about like conclusions and validity, or it could be the synthesis, the last step, the hazard characterization after you've done the exposure and the effects analysis. Any comments on that? Some things to consider that I thought about would be like, are the conclusions consistent with the evidence? Are the conclusions supported by the data?
I think one of the real strengths of this report is that it is North Carolina specific. And part of the risk characterization, as Jamie alluded to, was the use of this margin of exposure approach. And that is a very standard and method, and it has, and it is specifically the guidance on which that method is used has been, again, subject to peer review and comment. So the methodology from the use of the margin of exposure is, again, it's consistent with what is typically done. It has received peer review. It is consistent not with what is done nationally in the US, but also I believe internationally as well.
Thank you. Jamie?
It may also be important to note, and this is in the document, I believe, that this is, these conclusions are based on the data that are currently available. The report does talk a little bit about metabolites and some of the unknown toxicities that could arise from metabolites. I don't know if we can conclude that this level would be protective of effects that do arise from the metabolites, but it appears to be people should be reasonably protected from effects of metabolites with this particular value. And I don't know if somebody who knows more about the metabolites would be able to comment on that, but it seems to me that the effects likely do arise from the metabolic breakdown products of 1,4-dioxane. So we would anticipate those effects arising from the metabolites themselves to be protective with this approach.
Thank you. I had just a couple of comments on the synthesis of exposure and effects and summary statements. I don't find these to be unreasonable. They're not disqualifying. It's just something to think about for future risk communications. I have no reason to doubt it, but the conclusion in the summary statement about North Carolinians being exposed to the third highest level from the UMCR data isn't something that you can gather from the data in the report because of the way that the data are binned. So you can see max values and percentiles and means and standard deviations, but without a characterization of all the data or a link to all the data, you wouldn't be able to find an ordered value that says North Carolina, that there was somebody else, and then North Carolina. Since that's a major conclusion of the report, it's just something to think about for future reference in terms of a way to demonstrate that. But the data is all available for somebody to download and find that because it's referenced at UMCR. So it's clear and transparent in terms of what the source of the data was. It's just a statement that's hard to follow in the report, not disqualifying at all. And then another one in terms of the synthesis, not wrong, just a different way to do it. But I think could be helpful for risk communication going forward is that the risk synthesis moves to comparing the effects data with the levels that were above detection. Totally appropriate. There could be a statement added there before that about the frequency with which the samples were detected, since the detection limit was so much lower than the screening value, that big chunks of exposure were below effects assessment as a foundation. Now let's talk about the significance of the ones that were above detection, if that makes sense. To me, that's a big ticket conclusion that's only supported by the good effects, the good exposure assessment work that was done that John pointed out is kind of unique, makes this work unique, which is another aspect of scientific reasonableness. Does it contribute to the body of science? It does. There hadn't been an exposure assessment synthesis before. Anything else on the risk assessment step, the synthesis of the exposure data and the effects data, or the overall conclusions?
I mean, the overall conclusion seems scientifically reasonable to me. I think it's important to be as clear as we can about that.
Other perspectives, either on the sections that we're talking about or overall concluding statements like John's?
I agree with what John just said.
Thank you, Rich.
Tom, did you want to ask Gina if she had any comments?
Oh, yeah, thanks for reminding me. Gina, we're at a section where we're looking at the synthesis of the exposure data and the effects data, talking about were the methods used appropriate for hazard assessment and risk assessment and overall conclusions, whether they're consistent with the evidence or any other summary statements that you'd like to make about scientific reasonableness of the work that was done.
Thank you. I don't have any comments that haven't already been made, so yeah, nothing different.
All right. Well, I'll offer that I think a path forward could be, we can, Franny and I can work on a synthesis of what was stated here, section by section. Y'all can be thinking about whether there's any other criteria for scientific reasonableness besides the ones that I covered: methodologies, sources of data, methods of data synthesis, conclusions following results. We touched on some other ones in terms of clarity, reproducibility, significance. If we synthesize that and circulate it as a draft, it would have the advantages of being able to include the 3 people that we don't have here today on the board for a chance for them to contribute to it as a draft, as well as for y'all to have more time to think about it. Does that seem like a reasonable path forward? Any closing comments then before we leave this topic for the day?
I think that your presentation that showed the charts there are online. Is that right?
Yeah, and I will include all 3 of the presentations I've given on this over the last 3 meetings
Okay.
in today's meeting materials when
Thank
they
you.
go up.
That would be nice to make sure we're pulling everything forward. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that concludes that business item. I know that Rich has to go. Thank you for participation, Rich. It's good to see you as always. And I'm going to call on Deputy Secretary Sushma Mesmore to introduce a special guest that we have today, new DEQ Secretary Reed Wilson. I'll say, that we all serve here at the pleasure of the Secretary of DEQ and DHHS, and we're so glad to welcome you here today and hear what you have to say to us. We are your board.
The Secretary Reed Wilson is the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Secretary Wilson brings a wealth of experience in environmental protection, land conservation, and government and nonprofit leadership to DEQ. As Secretary, his priority is helping Western North Carolina rebuild, which we heard about, and protecting our air, land, water, and thus safeguarding our public health. Previously, Secretary Wilson served as the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. The Secretary has also held senior leadership positions at the U.S. EPA, including serving as the agency's Chief of Staff. It's my pleasure and honor to bring Secretary Wilson to the podium.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Mesmore, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see all of you. I was going to say this morning, but good afternoon. Thanks for having me here today to join you. I bring you all warm greetings from our Governor, Josh Stein. It is great to be here with you today. Experts from across North Carolina in state and local government, universities, the research community. I am really grateful for your service on this advisory board that helps support DEQ and HHS. And speaking of HHS, Secretary Sangbai, I believe in 21 minutes has a hearing in front of the nominations committee, which is step 2 in getting confirmed by the full Senate. So I am hopeful and confident that all that goes well for him today. But from toxicology to public health to ecology and other issues, your expertise and evidence-based approach help us advance science and sound decision-making in our state. I'm glad to be joined here today by DEQ colleagues. I always want to stress how much I appreciate their work and their commitment to public service on behalf of everyone in our state. I love science. I want you to know that from day one here. And it dates back to a day when I was in 4th grade, where my parents said okay to a friend of ours who wanted to take me to his office. I grew up in DC, outside of DC. And so their friend happened to be a curator at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, curator of crustacea. And I will, it was a long time ago, and I will never forget that day and everything I saw when I entered his lab just jars and jars of dead stuff floating in formaldehyde, like really ooky looking stuff that I, had no idea these things existed. And then drawers and drawers of dried specimens. I just had the best time that day. And for Christmas, Santa brought me a microscope just a month or two later. I was a biology major in college, a political science major too, but one can argue whether that's really a science these days or not. But anyway, I thought about becoming a wildlife biologist, but at that point, I just didn't feel like doing more school. So I went off and did other stuff, and here I am today. But just to reiterate, I'm a huge advocate for quality science. And one of the great things I got to do at Natural and Cultural Resources is support and do everything I could for the Museum of Natural Sciences and the other scientific aspects of that department. So I am just very excited to be at DEQ. I'm about to wrap up my 3rd month. I am learning a lot every single day. There are so many issues, as you know. But there's one thing I already know, which is that our department is engaged in so many different ways in making people's lives healthier and better and supporting a strong economy in the state as well. And it's just a wonderful thing to be a part of that, because we're, everything we do affects everybody in all 100 counties. So I've been in North Carolina a little over 2 decades, and my jobs have taken me to all corners of the state. So traveling from the mountains to the sea, it just reminds me all the time, especially now that I have this job, how important it is that we work together to make sure that everyone in this state has clean air and clean water and clean land. I mean, it's just what we need to be working towards. And part of that is research and basing decisions on science. And I'll come back to that again and again in the next 5 minutes. But our department over the years has made great strides to collaborate with the research community to better understand the state of science on a range of issues and to ensure that North Carolinians are better informed and better protected. We simply can't make good decisions if we don't rely on high quality, unbiased science. If we don't rely on the data and the science, we will make bad decisions and people's health will be harmed. And we don't want that to be the outcome. It's that simple, science or bad decisions. So I know you're talking about 1,4-dioxane just now, and I know you've spent a lot of time on PFAS. I think you know well that PFAS and other forever chemicals are a huge priority for our department. We are committed to working with all stakeholders, and there are a lot of them, in addressing emerging compounds through a comprehensive, proactive, systematic approach. We all know that PFAS chemicals pose significant threats to health, cancers, reproductive effects, immune system disorders, developmental effects, behavioral changes, and more. So this work is really urgent. There's no time to waste. And I know that you on the Science Advisory Board have played a crucial role in advancing the science of PFAS in North Carolina through the work you've reviewed and conducted during board meetings and all the other times you're working on these things when you're not in this room at these board meetings. So I greatly appreciate your continued support on this issue, with this range of issues, and your support for making sure North Carolinians are healthy and that their exposure to these chemicals is reduced. We really are working relentlessly to learn more about PFAS compounds and figure out what to do to reduce people's exposure. I hear from Deputy Secretary Mazemore, I think every day on PFAS, and that's a good thing. It is a huge priority for us. And we're continuing to try and take actions to protect communities, to protect health, to reduce that pollution. You all know that in 2022, the department released its PFAS action strategy to clean up contamination, protect drinking water, and take actions to limit discharges in the first place. We are sampling water systems all over the place to determine the extent of PFAS contamination, and that's it. Big entities like water systems, but also smaller places like schools and daycare centers. We've deployed a robust set of ambient monitors that take samples for groundwater, lakes, streams, rivers, and land, air as well. So we're really trying to get a handle on this with, the most data we can possibly collect. Probably saw in the news, or if you didn't, you may have already heard about it, because you guys are very engaged. But last month we announced that under our direction, Chemours sent out roughly 150,000 letters to residences in a larger geographic area, near the Chemours plant near Fayetteville. We don't think 150,000 people are going to need sampling of their private wells. We think it's more like 10,000 people, but we had a public session last night trying to make sure that the people in the affected counties and areas are aware that they can have their private wells sampled for PFAS. And what's a little new is that portions of 2 counties are now in that area, Harnett and Hope. We're also making significant investments in water infrastructure to fight against PFAS because we believe that every single family and every single business deserves and expects that when they turn on the tap, the water is clean. So far, our Division of Water Infrastructure has provided $345 million in upgrades for water systems to protect against PFAS pollution. Another really important point, and I remember us stressing this a lot at EPA when I was there more than 25 years ago, is we need to make sure that in these actions, we're protecting everyone, including vulnerable people like kids and the elderly and folks with medical conditions. This isn't something that we can afford to not do that with everybody. So that is a big goal of ours as well. So your work on these issues and so many other ones are essential to our collective progress to try and make sure that air, water, and land are healthy and safe for people. And again, making decisions based on the science, the quality science is essential. We rely on all of you to help us do that in the right way. And it was just very informative for me to sit here for the last 10 minutes and observe you as you consider this report on a really important issue. The thought and the care that you and the expertise you bring to this is just, it's heartwarming to me that you all are investing your time in this effort. I really, really appreciate that. We're going to continue to work together. I know that. I know there's been a strong partnership between the department and this board for years. And we're going to work together to get the answers we need to protect North Carolinians. So I want to thank you for being here today, but also for everything you do, engage with this advisory board on the other days when you're not here, but also the work you do on these issues and others to help make sure that we do have robust science to, undergird the decisions we need to make to protect people. So I look forward to working with all of you. I'm going to come to more of these meetings. Your conversation does take me back to biology a gazillion years ago and how we would delve into these things. And it was really interesting. Like, I love that. Anyway, look forward to working with all of you so we can make sure that everybody in all 100 counties is healthy and safe and does not suffer environmental harms. So thanks for this opportunity to say hello. And I will let you get back to your agenda. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your comments here and are glad to be your partners in science-guided environmental management.
Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention, my father for a time worked for the director of the National Science Foundation back in the 70s. So anyway, sort of runs in the family.
Well, you missed the analogy that I gave earlier when Deputy Secretary Mace-Moore was commenting on the state's priorities, catching us all up since the last meeting. And she focused on Helene, and I used the analogy of all of us grew up in science with a microscope, and there's the coarse knob and the fine knob. And before you can do the fine tuning, you need to worry about the big things and get those into focus. And it seemed like the agency's priorities in environmental protection and their focus is appropriately placed on Helene relief and waste and debris that's coming from that and serving the largest number of citizens in terms of that impact, while not taking their eye off the ball on a myriad of other topics. So appreciated. You mentioned a microscope in your opening remarks. It seems like we have a kindred spirit.
Yeah, well, the other little connection to this board is that my son and Detlef's daughter were in preschool together 20-something years ago.
Well, if we keep talking, we're going to find all kinds of connections.
Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And you're welcome to stay and join us for lunch because I believe that's where we are on the agenda. unless I'm wrong, Franny, who's approaching the podium.
It's lunchtime.
So let's see, we are going to reconvene when? How about 1 o'clock? Will that work? 40 minutes? Let's reconvene at 1. Peter, if you don't mind posting that in the chat somewhere, that lets people know that we're on break until 1 if they want to rejoin us then. And yeah, see you at 1 for a couple of information items from DEQ. Call us back together for the last couple of items on the agenda. An update on what was a charge for our December meeting that I think is now going to be held in abeyance for a little bit on PFMOAA. And then an update on the Keymore's consent order studies. So these are 2 information items that Franny's going to introduce to us.
I am going to just go through this recommendation that the board gave us in 2022 for the FMLIA and the review of its toxicity information that's available. And then the current status of the request we made to the board in December.
We're not hearing you. I don't know if it's not amplified or not.
No, I don't think these are on yet.
Sorry. So I'm going to briefly go over the history of the board's recommendation that was provided to DEQ in 2022 for PFMOAA, which is one of the Keymore's consent order PFAS, and then review the request that DEQ made to the board at the end of last year regarding this compound. So this is a brief synopsis, and these slides are pulled from other presentations I've given on the same topic. So you've seen these before, but this is not meant as a comprehensive overview. This is just pulled from the recommendation text. We had 3 meetings in 2022 where we discussed 2 peer-reviewed publications of PFMOAA toxicity. The questions we posed to the board were to review the studies and assess the quality based on sample, dose, and endpoints measured, and then to determine if these studies that had been published at the time provided sufficient scientific information to determine the toxicity values we need to have a reference dose and a subsequent either health-based level or standard. At the time, those 2 studies, while they were of high quality, had limitations that precluded their use for derivation of a reference dose, and particularly it was based in the lack of statistical significance of a critical effect, which is imperative to deriving a point of departure and reference dose. So in the interim, this was the recommendation in 2022. The board wanted DEQ to periodically refresh their literature search for this compound and review the papers that are relevant for inclusion in the toxicological synthesis with the new information. When this is posted, these links do work, and they will take you back to the recordings of these discussions that happened in 2022 at those 3 meetings. So in 2024, we had Dr. Justin Conley come and present his recent publication that detailed the reproductive rodent toxic information for PFMOAA. This was a significant addition to the literature base. So now there are 3 published papers that detail the toxicity of PFMOAA. In the presentation from December, Dr. Conley's presentation is summarized, and then also the presentation he gave us is also on our website, and I can make that available in the meeting materials for today as well. And so at the end of the last meeting, we asked the board to review these 3 studies now and to determine if this is sufficient for deriving a point of departure and therefore a reference dose or identifying a point of departure. This was the request we made at the end of last year, and I have some updated information to share with the board that I think may already be common knowledge among those around the horseshoe. But so previously, DEQ proposed PFMOAA to the EPA as a priority compound for toxic review. And this was done before we made the recent charge to the board, and this was done while we were reviewing the 2 studies that had been done for PFMOAA in 2022 and 23. In January of 2025, DEQ received notification that the EPA's Office of Research and Development was in the process of formally reviewing PFMOAA's toxicity literature base with the goal of deriving a reference dose. As of mid-March, being March 13th is when I received this email, the internal review portion of this literature review and draft toxicity assessment were complete, and the draft was to be sent for external review.
Brandy, is that a IRIS assessment or a
It's an-
PPRTB?
It's a ORD assessment, so it's the same as the PFPRA assessment we looked at.
Okay.
It's a very small literature base, but there was a request from an impacted state to review. So it won't be at the same level as an IRIS assessment, but it will be done by ORD with this goal. The last I was informed was it was being sent for external review. That's the last status update I've had. And so in light of all of this, we are going to rescind our previous request to the board and await ORD's final toxicity assessment before we ask the board to review and or recommend this toxicity assessment for use by the department. The caveat here is that we don't know what the current status of this toxicity assessment is. I don't know if it has actually been sent for external review yet. And I do not know who the lead author is. So I have been having a difficult time locating the exact status. And so in the event that this report does not leave EPA or is not ever completed, we may revisit this request with the board, pending more information. But right now, we're going to pull this one back.
Any questions or comments for Franny on this update?
Jamie, I thought you had a public, is that not right? Oh, look at that look. Sorry, Jamie.
I feel like the graduate student who's getting asked when their dissertation will be finished. I am the bottleneck on that manuscript, and I've just had other
Okay.
items that have taken priority. But I can tell you, based on the results of our work with PFMOAA, which we administered at higher doses than the Woodliff et al. Study, the result where we saw immune suppression was at an administered dose higher than what Conley et al. Report in their studies. So while our manuscript, if and when accepted for publication, will be supportive of immunotoxicity as being a potential endpoint of concern, it will not be at a lower level than what the Conley et al. Study demonstrated. I think even with benchmark dose modeling, I think we're still going to be at a higher administered dose than what they administered.
Did
and
you
saw
have a lower
effects.
dose than the one you saw effects at?
So we only saw suppression of the IgM antibody response in male animals at the highest dose administered, which for PFMOAA was 50 milligrams per kilogram. Again, that's a mouse dose.
Yeah.
No intent to be environmentally relevant or human relevant. This is a mouse relevant dose for immunotoxicity.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Elena?
I have also tried to find out who the lead is on development of this assessment, and I have not been able to find out either. But I will follow up.
Great.
I'm going to follow up right now.
Well, you throw up your last slide again about holding this in abeyance. To me, that makes really good sense. Oftentimes, the agency defers to EPA's products anyway. And it seems to be real consistent with the state's PFAS action strategy that if another entity is working on a synthesis, a standard, a science product or whatever, then let them do that as long as it's timely and going to be a good one, scientifically sound, and let North Carolina folks focus on things that might be unique to North Carolina where we have to fill in the gaps. So I think it makes sense from a standpoint of both the quality of the product that you'll get and also prioritization of resources. And finally, I guess the last thing I'll say is if you ever decide to crank it up, I think it's a pretty quick answer in terms of reviewing one study that we've all heard about and got a presentation on from the lead author that was a dosing of a mammalian system with the drinking water route of exposure over a long enough period of time frame to include reproductive effects. So sensitive endpoints to the contaminant of interest, sensitive life stage, mammalian model, proper route of exposure, a well-established protocol with replication. It's been published. We'd probably get pretty fast to saying, yes, it is an adequate information base. So somebody needs to go do that. And if they're doing that, then so be it. Any other comments on that one? All right. And Brandon, are you also doing the Chemours consent order study update? All right.
All right, and so this is the last information item on our agenda today. And I am happy to share some of the final results we received from an additional aquatic tox test since the last meeting. But I'll go through this, the preamble as usual. And so what I'm going to present is the status update of all of the Chemours consent order toxicity studies and the results we've recently gotten. Just as a quick overview before I kind of get into the details, I have status updates for both the aquatic tox studies and the rodent tox studies. Previously, in December, I presented the results from the algae toxicity test, the acute Daphnia, and the fish survival tox test. Today, I'm going to present the results from the chronic Daphnia test. To take a step backwards, the Chemours consent order is a long document that has many paragraphs. The paragraph that details the toxicity testing requirements is in paragraph 14. And these are the 5 PFAS that are included in attachment B, which is the 5 that are required for toxicity testing. And so all 5 of these are required for every tox test that is done. So there's 5 individual tests for each of the kinds of tests that I'll explain in a second. And so the language from the consent order for the toxicity studies just says that these shall be conducted following US EPA, OECD, or TSCA or Office of Pollution Prevention methods. Other appropriate programs as determined by DEQ can be included. And so the approved protocols were often a combination of a few of these methods, if not one specifically. But all of these were reviewed by DEQ, and it was an iterative process. It was not approved right away, but all of the methods have been approved at this point. And so the rodent toxicity studies are, there are 4, and these studies are going to be done on both mouse and rat models. they're doing the classic toxicity, the 90-day, national toxicity program tests, and then also the 28-day immunotoxicity tests. The ecological tox studies or the aquatic tox studies are 5 in number, and there's an acute algae tox test, both an acute and chronic Daphnia toxicity test, and that's a zooplankton. There is the fish toxicity study, which is a survival assay, and then the last is the freshwater invert test, which is just earthworms in sediment. I'll go through kind of the status of all of these before I show you the results. There were a variety of approval steps for each of the studies. All of the protocols were approved. The range finding tests were conducted. We discussed the final doses that would be used in the definitive tests. These definitive tests were conducted in 2023 and 2024. The final reports have been sent to DEQ for everything except for the worms and sediment tests, which is currently underway. And that's because we required additional modifications to the protocol, and they had to do some validation studies before they could finalize that protocol. To look at this a little bit differently, this just shows the months and years that everything was approved. And so you can see the final reports have all been sent to DEQ for the first 4 tests for all 5 compounds, and the sediment tests. I've seen the range finding results. We've discussed it. We've approved doses for the definitive tests. I have not received the range finding reports yet. But the definitive tests are scheduled to be conducted and might actually be underway already. The final report for that will follow. As far as the rodent toxicity studies go, this is a slightly different setup in terms of approval. The range finding tests were done first, along with analytical method validation to make sure the doses they were intending to dose with were actually what was in the dosing solutions. After all of that was done, we have meetings to discuss the definitive doses for the final tests. And once that's agreed upon, they write those doses into the final protocol, and that's what's approved. And this is just a different lab that is doing this, and this is their protocol. Once that final protocol is approved for the compound and the specific doses, the definitive test is conducted and the final report is sent to DEQ. I have this separated by compound and not by test. And so we've received, everything has been approved for NAFI and byproduct 2. And the final report is expected to be at DEQ any day now. There have been a few minor delays at the end of last year with the holiday. And I spoke to their toxicologist just last week, and he said that he is under final review and he'll send it to me before the end of the month. So I will get that soon. The other 4 compounds have all had range finding reports submitted to DEQ. We've had meetings for all of the final definitive doses for all of these compounds. I am waiting on the final protocols for those compounds to approve them, and then they'll be scheduled. And that is really just a bookkeeping kind of step because we've already discussed the doses with Chemours and the lab, but I'm just waiting for the documentation. So, of note, the 28-day tests are also being done first. And then those tests and those results are going to inform the 28-day test doses, which we will also discuss before they finalize the protocol and I approve the final protocol. Okay, so I'm going to go through, do you have a question?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Sure.
So with the dose range finding studies, are these being conducted to make sure that the mice and rats aren't receiving overtly toxic doses, but efficacious doses?
Yes.
So they're not based on environmental concentrations?
No.
Okay.
And they're, one of the range finding tests did result in more toxicity than would have been useful. And so those doses were scaled back for that particular compound. And not all the doses are the same for every single compound, but yes, they are efficacious doses and not done with the intent of overt toxicity.
can I ask a question too? For the length of those range finding studies, are they 14-day or 5-day?
That's a great question, and I have them. I don't remember.
Okay.
Offhand, but I can let you know.
All right,
I
thank you.
cannot remember right now. Okay. And so, so this is an aquatic toxicity test. This is a zooplankton model animal. They are commonly known as a water flea. They're pretty cute. These are the results from the 7-day toxicity test. And so the first thing I do when I review the range finding results and the final report is make sure the validity of the test, the conditions for validity are met for these compounds, because if any of these conditions are not met, the test is considered not valid and should be redone. These 5 conditions were met for all 5 of those consent order compounds for this test. The first is immobility or signs of disease in the control group. And so if the control group is suffering, it speaks to animal quality, not necessarily toxicity of the test substance. The dissolved oxygen is required to be a certain level so the animals can breathe. This is a reproductive test. And so the number of offspring per parent is counted at the end, and that just must be more than 15 individual offspring. The concentration of the testing compound can't vary more than 20% in the testing chamber. And then 60% of all the surviving females at the end of the study must have produced at least 3 broods of offspring. And that just speaks to their health at the end of the study. But all of those conditions were met, which is great news. So the first set of results I'm going to show you is just percent survival. And so the last Daphne results I showed you were percent immobility. And so the higher the percentage, the worse the results, or more toxic at the results. And so this is the opposite. This is percent survival. And so you want a very high percentage of survival because that speaks to how many animals have not died. Along the bottom, there are the 5 compounds, and they are all different colors and shapes on the lines. And then the percentage of survival is on the y-axis. The doses are along the bottom. The one note I will make here is that not all of the doses were exactly the same. They did vary a little bit per compound, but this is the mean plus or minus 0.1 of the doses that were used. The percent survival axis is also beginning at 80, because that is the lowest percentage of survival that was measured in these tests. And so that's the bottom. It's not 0, it's 80. So the scale goes from 80 to 100. And so the interesting results that are of note is first this green line that goes down at the 0 dose. And this is one of the reasons that the quality of animals is important in the control dose. So this is a control dose with 0 test compound for PEPA. 90% of the animals survived in the control dose. And so if that number had been lower, the conditions for validity may not have been met, but only 1 animal died in the control dose. And so no other animals died in any of the dosing groups. And so it just is individual variation and not a toxic effect. But it's in the data, and so I'm showing it to you. The other thing to note is all the way on the other side, the purple line that goes down to 80% at the dose of 10 is for naphthalene byproduct 2. And at the end of the test at 7 days, 20% of the individuals had not survived. This was the most significant change in survival in the entire swath of tests. And it was just for naphthalene byproduct 2, which I think is interesting to note. But 80% survival is still a lot. So do you have a question, please?
So you said significant. So significant in that this is meaningful given the parameters of the test because you needed a certain amount of survivability, or statistically or biologically significant?
I mean, in terms of the test, because I haven't run statistics on it. And I can't remember offhand if there are statistical analyses in the final report. I don't know that they are because it's from the lab. There could be. There are many pages. I don't remember. But yes, that was the only toxic effect.
So you're saying that the laboratory that conducted the analyses did not provide any, as far as what you can recall, statistical approaches or interpretation of the data? They just provided you with the raw data and it's up to you to provide the interpretation?
No, so they did provide the raw data, but there was also a comprehensive report that they wrote. I just cannot remember if statistics were included, because I haven't read them.
Well, if they provided
in
summaries or
detail.
graphs or averages or standard deviations, they provided statistics, just
That
maybe
is-
no hypothesis testing or
Yes,
inferential
okay.
statistics?
That's a great point. So yes, they did do summary and descriptive statistics. I was thinking more about like comparisons of means and multiple comparisons and things like that. So
Okay.
yes,
Just because. I mean,
descriptive
report-
statistics, not.
But the authors of the report then, to the best of your recollection, sorry, I'm not trying to put you on the spot but I'm just trying to understand if they
Yeah.
provided interpretation of study results for you all, or if you all will be providing, for example, the board and the public with your interpretation of the study results.
They did summarize their data. I will be providing my interpretation of their results. Yeah, the reports are not circumspect. It's just that I don't want to shade the way I present this because I just wanted to present the data. And so I didn't read more than the results in preparation for this. So I don't remember entirely.
No, I
Sorry.
appreciate that. I think providing us with the data and then letting us work with you to understand what the results mean, I think will be a good approach.
Okay, thank you. What am I looking at now? Okay, so these were the range finding results. And this is the definitive test results. And so this is percent survival on the 7th day. This looks a little bit different. And so really the only change here in the definitive test was at the highest dose, and it was not for naphthalene byproduct 2. It was for PMPA, which is one of the smaller compounds. And there was, I think, 2 individuals that did not survive. 1 or 2. Yeah, so it's 90% survival, and that was the only one that had any kind of toxic result to speak of.
So one quick interpretation of that was if the initial screening criteria for test validity was 80% survival of your controls, everything survived more than 80%.
Yep.
Acute toxicity, probably not a concern with this experimental animal in these tests for
Yeah.
all chemicals over 7 days.
I would do it.
The other test or endpoint they used in this toxicity test was counting the number of offspring per surviving parent. And so that was one of the conditions of validity of the test, was that each surviving parent had at least 15 unique individuals in their offspring in each brood. And so this is the average number of offspring per parent at the 7th day. All of these are above 15. And so some of the compounds had more or less offspring per parent. I can't speak to whether these are statistically different or not because I did not do the comparison. But you can see they all were above 15. And it's interesting how the lines vary a little bit, but they don't vary all that much, just by a few individuals,
So no effect.
essentially.
Yep.
Yes.
You don't need a lot of statistics to see that.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, the aquatic toxicity tests were all different. The algae results were quite different that I presented in December. PFMOAA had more of an effect in that model system. All of the compounds seem to behave differently in these different model systems, which is really interesting. And I think the foresight of choosing these 5 was better than I think they knew at the time, because some of them are quite similar to other compounds, and we know more about naphthalene byproduct 2 than we do about all the others. And so it's a good comparison across the 5. I think it.
So, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but
Please.
in terms of the environmental levels, getting back to the question, about where are those on this? Do you have any idea?
So these are milligram per liter.
Right.
Our environmental levels in the river are nanograms per liter.
Right.
And
Much,
so
much lower.
orders of magnitude lower.
Okay.
Yes. And so that is, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, but that is the design of a toxicity test, is to at least attempt to induce toxicity with higher concentrations that may be found in the environment.
But for PFMOAA, for example, previously recorded concentrations were like 35,000 nanograms per liter.
Have
I
been
believe.
observed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so the next steps in the procedure for these tests, according to the consent order, is that the first thing I need to do is approve the remaining protocol, which is the worms and sediment. I did that actually in November of 2024. And so that test is either scheduled or underway, and we should be getting the final report in the next several months. It depends on how long it comes from the lab and to Chemours to review. I am anticipating any day now the first final report from the 28-day rat toxicity immunotests. It's for naphthalene byproduct 2. This test has been finished. I have talked to Chemours' toxicologist about this when the test was underway and when it was finished. He is reviewing the final report and should be sending it to me at any time. So I'm expecting that any day now. The remaining studies with forthcoming results would be that earthworms and sediment freshwater inverts test, and then the remaining 4 compounds for the 28-day immunotoxicity tests in rats, and then all 5 compounds for the 28 days in mice. And then finally, when those are finished, we can use the doses to inform the 90-day tests, and those will be conducted in succession.
This is
So
great.
relative to PFMOAA, any idea when that data would be available, since that's relevant to that last charge?
I believe PFMOA is the next one that they're going to start with for the 28-day rat immunotox test. I'm fairly certain that is the next one on the schedule. And I think that the order was just proceeding kind of the way they were listed in the consent order.
Yeah, if
But
there's a way to
Yeah, be encouraged.
prioritize that, that might be really meaningful.
That'd be the
It might
best one next, yeah.
double the size of the data set for a compound that you're about to get some other work on. Even if it doesn't catch up to EPA, it'd be a nice piece of information to have with which to evaluate whatever they come up with or augment it for a local application.
that is a great point. And when we were discussing the doses for the definitive tests, I recall us discussing the order of the compounds, and I did suggest we do that one next because it's one that we're just interested in. I need to consult the schedule, see the dates that they're actually scheduled, but I believe PFMYA is next.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's it. So what do these results mean? The aquatic toxicity results are quite different from the mammalian results. And so these results help us understand what the environmental impacts of these compounds in the Cape Fear River are or could be. All 5 of these tests provide a basis for understanding of how these compounds have impacted the different trophic levels in this freshwater ecosystem. And that's the intention behind these tests. That's why they were chosen and why they were included in the consent order. These results could be used to derive bioconcentration factors, and often those are used in place of a bioaccumulation factor, which is derived from information from the environment. And so often it is more cost effective or more timely to do these tests in a lab. a more accurate number comes from the environment because it includes all forms of exposure rather than just a water exposure. But that's another utilization of this particular data set. And I think it would be interesting to compare the bioconcentration factors derived from lab data to the accumulation factors we measured in the Cape Fear River and also the ones that have been published by the EPA. These results are unlikely to be used to derive human health values without rodent data to corroborate their findings. These are environmental impact intended tests. That's why they were chosen. And so it's not for human health data, but it can help support those critical effects or the doses as a basis for understanding. But I digress. That's it.
Any questions for Franny about the consent order studies?
I think we asked along the way.
Yeah, we did ask most along the way.
Yeah, I just have one other comment, and you've heard it before. I'm like a broken record on this point. I know it's technically Chemours data.
Yes.
But if there's any way you can convince them to allow this to be published in the peer-reviewed literature, that is extremely useful for providing credibility in terms of if these data are used to derive health protective guideline values. And they also waving the flag for PFAS comprise such a massive number of chemicals that they're very amenable to approaches that are in vitro prioritization approaches that are driven by both exposure, which clearly we have that piece in North Carolina, as well as their associated hazard, which is important for anchoring results of in vitro testing, but are also used for prioritizing these chemicals for further study. So just.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that if the authors of the study, whether it's Chemours or the project managers at Charles River or at Eurofins are able to publish this in the literature, that I think they should. The layer of complication there, and I know this is a very like esoteric piece of peer-reviewed publishing stuff, but because these are part of the consent order, they are public information. And so I don't know that any journal would turn them away, but I also there are certain journals that don't want things that have been published on the internet or publicly. And so I think there's a balance to find there if they were to do that. But yeah.
Typically, what companies will provide are study reports. If they provide something publicly, they provide study reports and a peer-reviewed publication that provides another, and I'm familiar with looking at subchronic studies that are produced using OPTS guideline, following OPTS guideline criteria. And they are voluminous documents with lots of detail and where they give you the individual data, which is great, but they frequently are more thin on interpretation and statistical analysis in terms of dose response analysis. Like they're not going to do benchmark dose modeling unless you pay them to do it.
Yeah, that's true.
Another thing is a couple more things, availability, things on the website, may go missing at some point in the future if it's in the published literature in some more place. And context, a lot of times the report's just going to present the data, whereas the discussion section of a publication will be in context. And you could probably get over that hump about it being available someplace else if you think about the bioaccumulation literature that we all went through or the water quality standard setting. There was both an EPA report and data set that was a synthesis of all the available BCFs and BAFs, but there was also a publication by the same lead author, get it out there in the refereed literature. So I think it's a good point, and it could be a a bridge building thing to the lead toxicologist over there of saying, let's work on something together.
Yeah.
Get it out there. It's one of the things that just provides some more scientific imprint, sure. And the only other thing I'll say to your conclusions, I think all those are supportable, but you can demystify some of this some more when you give presentations to folks. I think you could probably go a little bit further in terms of saying, things like really the graphs were exaggerated. Everything below 80, was cut off. You did say that, but a point being there, that none of these results are in excess of what would be acceptable control survival in a normal test. So there's really no difference here that could be called out. That's a good bottom line. And maybe a general one, just in terms of the way these chemicals work, somebody in the room will know of chemicals for which I'm wrong, but it's almost like, if you know of a compound that's carcinogenic in people, the environmental exposures aren't going to be what's going to drive a standard setting. It's going to be human health protection because of that 1 in a million cancer risk and low dose extrapolation. So it'd be a way to say, it's not surprising when we talk about chemicals that have a human cancer component, that the environmental data wouldn't be useful or not going to be a driver of standard setting, period. And then that just puts it in context of, it's not, like you were saying, it's not unexpected, but we've checked. There's no surprises here in terms of environmental drivers.
Yeah, I have been kind of withholding my own interpretation of the data, especially for the acute dyspnea until I saw the chronic dyspnea. And so I'm happy to present something like that at the next meeting to hear your thoughts on the data and my interpretation of it. But I think there's value in just showing the data and giving it to you to consider and for the public to consider before I shade it with what I think.
And if you give it to managers, though, it'd be good to include a line at the bottom, a box or a star that says expected environmental concentration, maximum ever recorded environmental concentration, modeled upper 95th percentile concentration, just so that somebody can look at the effects data and say, oh, this is still an order of magnitude higher than exposure data. So kind of nothing to see here in terms of implications for existing exposures. I just think it'd be helpful for anybody that doesn't live and breathe these type of data. Just go ahead and you can turn it from an effects analysis into a hazard analysis by just adding a little bit of extra information on exposure. Yes.
I would just caution a margin of exposure comparison for PFAS because of the difference in an elimination kinetics between mice and humans. And without knowing the clearance factor in humans, it may be challenging to make that direct type of comparison. Certainly you can make it, but just maybe say this is based just on what people are taking in without knowing anything about or molecular sites of action concentrations.
Yes, yeah. And so I think if I were to do that with the rodent data, there would be additional caveats. I think with the aquatic tox data, I would just use the river concentrations that I've measured myself.
Any other questions or comments? Elena?
Yeah. Sorry, little technical detail difficulty there. Yeah, I think from the standpoint, this is actually a question for you. Are they doing bioanalytical results? I mean, are they measuring serum concentrations and quantifying those in the in rats at the end of exposure across doses? As in, are they measuring plasma concentrations of any of these of the parent chemical?
For the rats, there's more material, and so they're doing, I believe, serum or plasma or a blood draw. Like they're taking blood and then also urine for rats. And for mice, there is a little less, but I can't remember the endpoints they're looking at in each. They are different. The tables are different.
Yeah.
But I can consult them and get back to you.
What I'm asking are they measuring the parent chemical, like like the Naphian byproduct 2 or the PFMOA in serum. Because, yeah, they use, for a lot of their clinical chemistry, they will use urine, both typically blood, but sometimes urine as well, particularly in rats. But I'm looking for, are they measuring the chemical itself? Because that kind of information can be quite valuable for making inferences. So if they're measuring it, that's great.
I will consult the protocol. I am reluctant to say yes, because I know there were things that we asked for that were outside the official guidelines. And they sometimes they were considered and sometimes they were not, and it kind of depended on what yes, and what the abilities of the lab were. So I cannot say for sure, and so I will consult the protocol and get back to you.
Gina, do you have any questions for Franny before we let her go?
No, no questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Franny, for both of those updates. We appreciate it. That moves us to the public forum section of our agenda near the end. I've checked the list in the room and there is no one who has signed up to address comments or provide comments. And I'll ask Peter whether anybody online has indicated as such, and he tells me no. So public forum was opened and we've moved on from that, given that there's nobody who has asked to speak.
That's good. Point about that. So in the past, when we were talking about Gen X, some of the issues related to ChemWars, there was a tremendous amount of public interest. Are you getting a sense, I guess, Franny, maybe from the public that they are satisfied with the progress in terms of the monitoring that's been done, the consent order with ChemWars in terms of new data collection, the management approaches? Are you getting any feedback about that at all? I'm just curious.
So I guess the feedback that I get on the ChemWars effort in general from the public is fairly limited. I know that several people and community advocacy groups have told me that they want the test protocols for the tox studies and the results and all of that published on our website. And the intention is certainly to do that. I am the bottleneck there. But it's publicly available and, can be emailed if anybody wants it. I have not received any feedback, positive or otherwise, about the toxicity studies in about a year and a half, which I am grateful for. Yeah, but I think maybe Deputy Secretary Mazemore can answer this question, or perhaps Jared just attended a public meeting about ChemWars sampling, if you can. Anyone? Sorry.
While you're coming up, I'll just offer the perspective that I think we tend to have a lot of participation, not just on Gen X, but hexavalent chromium had people coming from other states to find out what we were doing because we were deriving something. We were producing a new product that had maybe some implications. Methyl bromide had folks coming in and paying extra attention for a while because we were reviewing a product that the state had derived, which was going to be used. So it could be that we've lately fallen into a mode of reviewing others' work as opposed to generating things that are new. It's just one observation. It wasn't just Gen X which was, again, us working with the state to do the benchmark dose modeling from industry studies. Those other two things generated a fair amount of interest as well, but that may be the difference of, are you creating something or reviewing something?
It could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I'm not sure, there are a lot of facets to this. I think the public in general is worried about so many PFAS compounds, right? We all know that. This work being done is at such a high scientific level that we probably need to figure out a way to communicate at a level that everyday person can understand. And what are the key findings as this data and this research is coming out that are how do we communicate that and what's alarming and what's not alarming on those limited number of PFAS compounds that this is being done. And it's taking a while, but also it's a very condensed, comprehensive, highly technical body of work. So what we haven't had a chance to do yet, because this is still rolling it out, it's just not fully carried out through the entire toxicity framework that Franny mentioned. So we're getting it in piecemeals. Any suggestions from you all as to how to best engage and disseminate this information, especially if there's any information that is clearly that we're not finding any major issues, or we are finding some major issues, and we need to look out for this, and this, or we advise the department to be aware of this. I think that would be helpful for our team as we reach out and are in public domains.
Thank you. Good perspective. The board does have a proactive role in the charter, not just reactive.
And can I offer another suggestion?
Sure.
The model that ATSDR uses in their tox profiles, while it might seem overly simplistic to people who are used to looking at tox data, it really does speak to the major questions that people tend to have. So if you look at some of that type of thing, they're kind of their part, the information they put together in their front piece for the tox profiles for a given chemical, just how it's phrased and everything. And if you have communications specialists, I would urge you, once things like this are synthesized, so they are at a higher level of or a more overarching level of, does this hurt my liver? That kind of thing, that you run anything you produced by your communications specialist if you have such people on staff, and I think you do.
Yeah, that's actually a great suggestion. I haven't looked at an ATSDR report since I reviewed the one for the vaccine report. But they're written in a way that is easy to understand, and the tables that they use to summarize the information are so clear. And so I think that's a good method of presenting data. Yes.
Yeah, the key thing is to just make it accessible for a more generalized audience.
Yes.
John?
So in the vein of being sort of prospective or proactive, I also serve on an air toxic science advisory board for the state of Oregon. And that group has been working for several years to develop a process for air toxics. It's specifically focused on air toxics. And what they've done is gone through a process of identifying what they consider to be authoritative sources, like EPA, like Cal EPA, for example, ATSDR. And they've pulled all the data for hundreds of chemicals related to air toxics into some data files that I have, and then have used the board that I'm on to go through the process of specifically looking at that process and the products of the process to support the development of air quality standards for the state of Oregon, which in one fell swoop may be hundreds of chemicals. So I don't know what the restrictions are in the state of North Carolina for a process like that. And maybe legislatively limited, I don't know. But it's been, I think, a nice model for how to deal with many chemicals in the environment in a thoughtful, coherent process, if you will. That's taken quite a bit of time, but in the end, it's not chemical by chemical, which is what we've been dealing with. It's looking at a process of taking authoritative values from others, like IRIS, and saying, let's adopt those. And then specifically, are there some of them that we have questions about, which tend to be the questions about mixtures of different things. Mixtures are hard to deal with. Metals sometimes are hard to deal with. So I don't know if, again, just to bring forward an idea that might be something to consider for the state, but there may be limitations in what the state can do in terms of something like the air toxics program, whether you can do that, or perhaps for water quality programs. Can you think about or comment about that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but to think about something like that.
You know, I think that that is such a valuable thing to do because we have so much exposure data across North Carolina, even just from those wells that were shown on the map earlier today. And I think it could even just be a way of distilling down out of those compounds which ones we have the greatest prevalence for, or the ones that also have any kind of associated authoritative value.
Right.
Because there are some compounds, at least previously, that ATSCR had a value for and then EPA did not, and
Right.
et cetera. A lot of the COMORS specific or consent order specific compounds have very little toxicity data at all. And so there's very few authoritative values for those compounds. There are a few exceptions, like naphthalene byproduct 2. There's a significant literature base for. PFHPA is another one. And so it's certainly a really great use of the data, and I like it. And I like the idea of putting it through a very systematic process of filtering. And I will talk to Jared more about how to do this
Okay.
in the coming weeks.
What I can do is perhaps share some of the data that I've got with you to give some sense of what they've done, because it's a tremendous effort.
Yeah.
And it's like, why to limit it to the consideration by the state of Oregon? I think other states, such as North Carolina, may benefit from that work as well.
Yeah, it sounds like it's I mean, for something that probably took a very long time to develop, but also a great model to follow
Right.
when there's a lot of compounds to consider. So yeah, I would love to see anything you can share.
But going back to part of my question is, are there legislative limitations in how you can do this? I don't know if there is or not.
I can speak to the ones that I know about.
Yeah. Sure.
And so in our rules, there are specific authoritative bodies that are preferred.
Right.
There's the possibility of using, and this is a question I get a lot, and so it's tangential to what you were saying, but there's the possibility of using information from mixtures toxicity studies, but they are for single values in our rules. We don't currently have the ability to regulate things by groups or in the way Massachusetts has, where it's a selective group with individual values, but then a collective summation. Our rules are just written a little differently. And so I think that it could be very useful for narrowing down those individual compounds to move forward with. And in the future, it could be useful for highlighting the compounds we have a lot of exposure data and very little toxicity data for, but then also using it again when there are mixtures data that are currently being generated at different federal entities, whether or not they are released soon.
Okay.
So yeah, our rules are a little bit different than many other states, and it's I know a point of frustration when I talk to members of the public that other states are able to do things that we cannot, but that's just the way that kind of all the states came to fruition when they were founded. So
Well, whether it's the board's work or individuals on the board or the fellows program that DEQ has, where you bring in outside scientists for a while to focus on a particular topic, whether it's used for rulemaking or whether it's just used to draw attention to things, it could be that those authoritative reviews or a compilation of other state standards, along with exposure data, what chemicals do you register in North Carolina, groundwater, surface water, air, would be a way to prioritize things that are already on the books for maybe turning the crank on.
That's right.
And if the idea that Franny's saying, is that the turning the crank may be prescriptive for how you have to go about it, it wouldn't preclude the need for the use of that information that you just talked about as a screening step to be able to say, well, which ones would you prioritize to turn the crank on individually before you turn the crank over and over and over, only to find out we learned it was protective.
I think the point is that you can use information like that for a variety of purposes.
Yeah, I
setting
like it.
priorities, evaluating, informing the public, setting standards. You don't have to just limit it to setting standards. You're exactly right. So
yeah.
Yeah, it could be that a 10-year-old, 20-year-old air quality standard is perfectly protective. Do you have to do a full review to find that out, or could you look at somebody else's recent authoritative review to jumpstart your thinking along with North Carolina exposure data that says, and do you care?
Right.
And should you care?
Yeah, I like that approach for a few of those endpoints. So I'll look into it a little further. Thank you.
Sure.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, maybe we could write it up as a, after you share your material, maybe we could write it up as a, flush it out a little bit in case it's something that the folks on the board want to do, or the staff wants to do, or that at least it's a body of useful work available to shop around to PIs, interested students on, this could be another chapter in your thesis.
A lot of things you could do with it.
And it could be useful.
Yeah.
But we could help frame it in terms of what its utility would be and start examining data sets that might inform the exposure side.
Right.
Anything else?
Yes.
I'll echo Franny's statement about frustrations from the public. Typically, you have a small percentage of the public who is willing and able to dig into the details and look at the science the same way this group can and does, and the way Franny and her staff do. So there's necessary translation that has to happen, which has pitfalls. Their first question is, could this be dangerous to my health, my family, my pets, et cetera? And if the answer is not unequivocally no, then their preferred concentration in the environment and drinking water is 0. And so beyond that, it's difficult for them to connect and translate to the science. My analogy is all of these compounds are ingredients and they're not in the kitchen preparing the meal. All they see is the meal. So there's a stew that they're concerned about that's being served up from 1,4-dioxane and others. And that's typically what we've heard in community meetings, and I've heard from the public. Well, what does all of it do together? It's all coming into my household at the same time. And that's typically the frustration. And science doesn't move in those ways, right? You just, it's almost impossible to look at all of it all at once. And it was, PFAS, for instance, was presented, a lot of things are presented as somewhat of an emergent situation. So they're looking for fast decisions and fast action. And it doesn't necessarily work that way either. So that's typically the communications we have around that. And when we speak in terms of years and they're thinking in terms of weeks, there's a translation that has to happen there.
Good perspective.
That's a great analogy. I like that.
Good to have a local health director who's connected to the public on the board. Yeah, and it, other aspect of risk communication there is, other aspect of risk communication is to note that standard setting isn't the only aspect of what goes on. There's been so much risk reduction from source reduction without having a standard, just as inertia shows that it's going to be regulated.
If y'all don't mind, I'm Peter Johnston, I'm IT guy, but I actually have a lot of exposure to public comments about PFAS and other related chemicals. I do rulemaking hearings, I read comments and write hearing officer reports and things like that. So I think it's a sort of reading the mood of the public. It's a gut emotional feeling. Oh my goodness, I drank this water. Am I going to get sick? Or I have cancer. Is this why? Is this why my dog is sick? Is this why more people have this? It's a very gut thing, and it freaks you out when you can't drink water. And so I think to connect with them, we can say, you know, as you said, is this safe? Yes or no? Well, the study says, well, there's 1 in a million that. Okay, why 1 in a million? You know, why is 1 in a million? Okay, that's what, 10 North Carolinians, right? Well, why do we have the standard here? A lot of people want to know why we haven't banned it, or why the limits aren't very, very strict, or even sort of what the overall plan is. Like, what's the plan here? Like, okay, we need to do more studies. We need to do more studies. Okay, well, what do I do while you do more studies? Where do I get my drinking water? Why doesn't Chemours install whole house filtration? It's nice that under the sink, but I still have to shower in it, right? Things like that. And then what do? Oh goodness, I've drank this water for decades. Am I going to be okay? That's the sentiment out there. It's a basic human emotional survival instinct of what do I do? And how can there be some justice here? That's where people are. That's what I see. Mm-hmm. And it is hard as a scientist to communicate a lot of these things to folks without just being very straightforward with them. Is this safe? Like yes or no? Mm-hmm. That's what they're looking for. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That speaks back to Elena's bit about ATSDR as a source of plain language questions and answers. Anything else from the board? Any other business before I go over some action items? So I had heard action items to post the final December meeting minutes. I had heard that we would get a link to the residential well sampling risk map that Jared led when it's available for people to look at online. Thanks for that work product. I heard from Deputy Secretary Mace-Moore and some of the rest of you to spend some time thinking about how to best engage the public and disseminate information. And I heard that John's going to provide some information on Oregon's approach to adopting other authoritative reviews as either standards or maybe we'll add on that this could also be used as screening criteria for how to prioritize maybe some standards or chemicals that would be worth taking a look at or a second look at. Any action items that we missed? Then I'll, before I close, say that the next meeting would be August 6th, unless we have a between meeting need that arises for which we can call one. I want to thank Franny and Paula and Peter for the support of the meeting today. Thank the board members in person for their participation, including Gina for hanging on the line with us for so long. Thank you. And if there's no other business, it'd be appropriate for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right,
Seconded.
all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, so everybody. We'll see you in August, and we'll be in touch with you before then on some of these action items.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.